Muriye Zimbabwe. Welcome back pamzinda wevanhu neni wenyu Super Nexus 2030 explosion. Mnangagwa's biggest political threat just emerged. So Zimbabweans, something very interesting has just happened in Harare. President Emmerson Mnangagwa has made 10 new appointments to Zimbabwe's Senate. And on the surface, this might look like a routine constitutional exercise, but look carefully at who has been brought into parliament. Because among the 10 names is one of the most powerful businessmen in Zimbabwe, Kuda Tagwirei. And suddenly, this is no longer just a story about 10 senators. This is a story about power. It is a story about who Mnangagwa trusts. It is a story about the people being brought closer to the center of the political system. And it is a story about what Zimbabwe could look like when the country reaches 2030. Because the political system that will exist in 2030 is already being constructed today. And perhaps the most interesting question is not who will replace Mnangagwa. The question is, who is Mnangagwa building around himself before that day arrives? Let's break this down. 10 senators, Zimbabwe, Tambuva Taura. The parliament has approved 10 people recommended by President Mnangagwa for appointment to the Senate. The 10 are Jabulani Sivanda, Mary Mliswa, Nokutula Matsikinyere, Kuda Tagwirei, Godwills Masimirembwa, Lucy Chitaga, retired Major General Gibson Mashingaidze, Makosin Hlongwane, Brilliant Dube, and Irene Mutumbga. Parliament approved the appointments on August 19. These aren't ordinary elected Senate seats. They are part of the 10 additional presidentially appointed seats created under Constitutional Amendment number 3, which expanded the Senate from 80 members to 90. The Constitution provides that these 10 individuals are selected based on professional skills and other competencies following consultation with the National Assembly. So officially, the explanation is simple. The Constitution created 10 new positions. The President selected 10 people. Parliament approved them. Done. But politics is never just about the paperwork. Because the composition of that list tells us something. Look at the mix. Look at the people coming in. You have political figures. You have a former war veterans leader. You have provincial party leadership. You have a retired senior military officer. You have a former cabinet minister. You have professionals. And then you have Kuda Tagwirei. That combination is fascinating because it isn't simply a list of 10 random professionals. It brings different sources of influence into the Senate. Political influence, party influence, military history, business influence, professional expertise. And that raises an obvious question. Was Mnangagwa simply filling 10 constitutional positions, or was he also making sure that the new political architecture contains people who understand different parts of Zimbabwe's power structure? We cannot say that was the president's intention. There is no public evidence proving that, but we can certainly examine what the appointments mean. And one appointment stands out above the rest, Zimbabwe. Kuda Tagwirei. For years, Kuda Tagwirei operated primarily in the world of business, but his relationship with the political establishment has been impossible to ignore. He has served as an advisor to Mnangagwa. He joined the ZANU-PF Central Committee in 2025, and now, August 2026, he has entered the Senate. That is a significant political progression. Think about the difference. A businessman can have enormous influence without holding public office. But a senator is formally part of Zimbabwe's legislative establishment. Tagwirei is now moving from the world of political influence into an official political institution. And that is why Zimbabweans are asking, why now? Why bring him into parliament at this particular moment? Why the Senate? Why under this new constitutional arrangement? And what does Mnangagwa expect him to do there? We don't have an official answer to all those questions, but there is something we can observe. Tagwirei is getting closer to the center of formal political power. That is a fact. This is where 2030 enters the story. Now, Zimbabwe, let's talk about the year everybody keeps mentioning, 2030. Because Zimbabwe's political system has just undergone a major transformation. Constitutional Amendment number 3 created these additional Senate seats and made several other changes to the country's political framework. The Senate has grown from 80 to 90 members, and the new system has changed the political environment surrounding the presidents. That means the parliament of 2030 could operate very differently from the parliament Zimbabweans have known. And this is important because when you change the political system, you change the way politicians think. Politicians begin asking different questions. Who controls parliament? Who controls the parties? Who controls the provinces? Who can build alliances? Who can command enough support? Who has the experience? Who has the resources? And who can become the face of the next political era? That is why these appointments deserve attention. They are happening at the beginning of a new political chapter. That's a great question. Now, let's be careful. There are already people saying Tagwirei is being groomed to become president. That is a massive claim. There is no official succession announcement saying Tagwirei is Mnangagwa'S chosen successor. There is no confirmed ZANU-PF resolution making him the future presidential candidate. And Tagwirei himself has not publicly announced that he intends to become president of Zimbabwe. So we should not present that as a fact. But here is what we can say. Tagwirei's political profile has been rising. He entered the ZANU-PF Central Committee. He has been closely associated with the president, and now he has been appointed to the Senate. Those developments are real, and that naturally creates speculation about where his political career could go next. Perhaps nowhere beyond the Senate, perhaps much further. Nobody knows. But the question is now being asked, why would a businessman need parliament? This is where the story gets really interesting. Zimbabwe. Tagwirei already had access to political circles. He already had business influence. He already had relationships with powerful people. So, why enter formal politics? Maybe the answer is completely straightforward. Maybe he wants to contribute his business and economic expertise to parliament. Maybe the government genuinely believes his experience qualifies him for one of the new professional Senate positions. That is entirely possible, but politics invites another interpretation. When somebody with major economic influence enters formal political structures, people naturally begin wondering whether their role is becoming bigger. And that is not unique to Zimbabwe. Business people entering politics happens all over the world. The difference here is the political environment. Zimbabwe is currently preparing for a major transition toward 2030, and the person entering parliament is not an unknown businessman. It is Kuda Tagwirei. That makes the appointment much more politically interesting. Look at Jabulani Sivanda. And Tagwirei isn't the only fascinating name. Take Jabulani Sivanda. Sivanda has a long history inside the Zimbabwe's Liberation War veterans and ZANU-PF structures. His return to a senior parliamentary role is significant because war veterans remain an important constituency within the ruling party. Then look at Godwill's Masimirembwa. He is ZANU-PF's Harare provincial chairperson. Then there is Mary Mliswa, a senior ZANU-PF figure from Mashonaland West. Then Gibson Mashingaidze, a retired major general and Mashingo War veterans leader. Then Makosin Hlongwane, a former cabinet minister. So, when you look at the entire list, you start seeing something. Different political backgrounds, different constituencies, different experiences, different networks. Again, we cannot claim Mnangagwa deliberately designed the list as a succession machine, but the appointments certainly bring a broad collection of politically significant figures into one institution. And that is worth watching. The Senate is getting bigger. This part is to overlook. The Senate has gone from 80 members to 90. 10 new people have been added through presidential appointments. That means the president has gained the ability to place 10 additional people into the upper chamber based on the new constitutional provision. Zimbabwe, the government says these appointments are based on professional skills and competencies. Critics, however, have questioned whether expanding presidential appointment powers increases executive influence over parliament. That debate is now part of Zimbabwe's political reality, and it will become even more interesting if the Senate becomes an increasingly important arena for future political battles, because these 10 people are not just sitting in a conference room somewhere. They are now part of the country's legislative machinery. The real power play here. This is where I think the story gets much bigger. Maybe the biggest development isn't Tagwirei. Maybe it isn't any individual senator. Maybe the biggest development is that Zimbabwe's political architecture is being redesigned while the next succession question is already hanging over the country. That's the story. The political system is changing, the institutions are changing, the parliament is changing, and political actors are positioning themselves inside the new system. That is what makes 2030 so important, because when Zimbabwe eventually reaches that point, the people who understand and control the new system will have an enormous advantage. And Mnangagwa is currently at the center of that transformation. Is Mnangagwa building a legacy? Right, this is another way to look at it. Perhaps Mnangagwa isn't thinking only about staying in power. Perhaps he is thinking about what kind of political system he leaves behind. His government has repeatedly presented Vision 2030 as the major national development objective. The constitutional changes have been defended by supporters as part of creating continuity. If that is genuinely the motivation, then these appointments can be viewed as part of the administration's attempt to create a broader pool of expertise inside the parliament. But critics will ask a different question. Are these changes strengthening institutions, or are they strengthening the president? That argument is going to continue, and it is one of the biggest political debates Zimbabwe faces. But there is something else. There is an uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this. If Mnangagwa is supposed to leave the presidency at the end of his current constitutional timetable, who controls the political machinery after him? Because presidents don't operate alone. They operate through parties, through institutions, through networks, through people, through relationships built over years. And when a president appoints people to powerful positions, those people can become part of the political architecture that survives beyond the president. That is why political appointments matter. A president can leave office, but the networks built during his presidency can remain. The post-Mnangagwa question, and this is where we should stop thinking about 2030 as simply who will be president. Instead, think about it as who will control the political system. That's a much bigger question. Because imagine that by 2030, you have a generation of politicians who have spent years building relationships inside parliament. Imagine party leaders who have spent years positioning themselves. Imagine businessmen who have become politicians. Imagine provincial structures that have become more powerful. Imagine new alliances. Suddenly, the succession battle becomes much bigger than one person. It becomes a battle over the architecture of the next Zimbabwe. And perhaps that is what we are beginning to see. The most interesting part about Tagwirei, here's what makes Tagwirei different. He doesn't come from the traditional political route. He didn't spend decades trying to become an MP. He didn't rise through a provincial party structure. His power originally came from business, and then his relationship with the political establishment brought him closer to government. Now, he has entered parliament. That is an unusual political journey, and it makes him difficult to classify. Is he primarily a businessman, a political operator, a party loyalist, a presidential advisor, a future politician? Maybe the answer is a combination of all of them, and that's precisely why people are watching him. Zimbabwe, could this be Mnangagwa's biggest threat? Here is the twist. The biggest threat to Mnangagwa may not actually be Tagwirei. It may be the political expectations created by the system itself. Once you begin changing political rules, you create new incentives. Once you extend political timelines, you give politicians more time to organize. Once you bring new people into parliament, you create new relationships. Once powerful individuals start thinking about life after the current president, succession politics becomes unavoidable. So the danger isn't necessarily one person, the danger is political momentum. Because eventually every ruling party has to answer one question: what happens next? And this is where Chiwenga fits. Of course, we cannot ignore Vice President Constantino Chiwenga. But this time, let's not make him the entire story. Chiwenga represents the established political hierarchy. Tagwirei represents something different. A businessman moving deeper into formal politics. And that contrast is fascinating. One man's influence comes from decades inside the political and military establishment. The other's influence comes largely from business and his proximity to the political establishment. If Tagwirei continues rising, the question won't simply be whether he can become president. It will be whether Zimbabwe's political elite is changing. Are businessmen becoming more powerful inside the ruling party? Are traditional political structures making room for new power brokers? Is ZANU-PF evolving, or is this simply another chapter in the party's long history of bringing powerful allies into its structures? Those questions are far more interesting than simply asking who is fighting whom. The biggest clue may be the timing. Think about the timing again. Constitutional Amendment number 3 becomes law. The Senate expands. 10 presidential appointments are created. Parliament approves the 10 names, and one of the most politically connected businessmen in the country enters the Senate. All of this is happening while Zimbabwe is looking toward 2030. That is the sequence, and sequences matter. It doesn't prove a secret plan, but it creates a political story, and that story is only beginning. What happens next? Now, watch what happens after these appointments. Who becomes more visible? Who gets promoted? Who starts appearing at major party events? Who receives important responsibilities? Who starts talking about Vision 2030? Who begins building relationships across provinces? Who becomes increasingly visible among younger ZANU-PF members? And most importantly, who does Mnangagwa trust with the political future of his administration? Because those clues could tell us more than any rumor. The 2030 countdown has started. Zimbabwe is now moving toward a completely different political environment. The current administration has more time, the Senate has expanded, the constitutional framework has changed, the political class is repositioning, and new people are entering formal positions of power. That means the 2030 question isn't something Zimbabwe should start thinking about in 2029. It is already happening right now in parliament, inside ZANU-PF, inside provincial structures, inside government, and inside the relationships between business and politics. And perhaps that's why the Tagwirei appointment is so interesting, because it could be nothing more than a Senate appointment. Or it could eventually be remembered as the moment a major businessman took his first official step into the center of Zimbabwean politics. Only time will tell. Final question, Zimbabwe. So, is Mnangagwa's biggest political threat already sitting inside parliament? We don't know. Is Tagwirei being groomed to replace him? There is no confirmed evidence proving that. Is Tagwirei becoming more politically important? Without question, his former appointment to the Senate is a major new development. And is Zimbabwe's political system changing? Absolutely. That is the bigger story. The 10 appointments may look like 10 names on a piece of paper, but behind those names are political histories, business networks, party structures, military backgrounds, and professional expertise. And among them is Kuda Tagwirei, a businessman who has now crossed another line from influence to formal political office. And now, Zimbabwe has to watch what happens next, because the most dangerous political player isn't always the person shouting the loudest. Sometimes it's the person quietly moving closer to the center. And right now, Kuda Tagwirei has just moved one step closer. 2030 is coming. The political architecture is changing, and the question is no longer simply who will replace Mnangagwa. The question is who is being positioned inside the new system before Mnangagwa's era eventually ends. Because whatever the answer is, the moves are already being made. So, thank you for joining me, for watching. Stay tuned. More fire. Trukubulisa. Ndino enyu super Nexus. Peace.